The autumn when I was 21, I was trying to save up enough for a security deposit on a new apartment. I got a job at one of those seasonal haunted house attractions. It was set up in a huge, dusty warehouse down by the industrial park, the kind of place that smells like damp concrete and ozone. They called it the Asylum. It was a classic low-budget operation. Plywood walls painted black, cheap strobe lights, and a fog machine that made everything smell like sweet chemicals. My job was as a scare actor. For 5 hours a night, I had to put on a grimy-looking hospital gown, some pale makeup, and sit in a corner of a room, rocking back and forth and occasionally lunging at groups of teenagers. My assigned room was deep inside the maze. It was supposed to be a sort of patient common room, I guess. It was filled with junk, overturned metal cots, scattered medical charts with fake blood on them, and a thick, soupy fog that never really cleared. In the back corner, there was this very realistic-looking prop. It was a mannequin of a patient strapped to an old-fashioned gurney with thick leather restraints. It was really the centerpiece of the room, positioned under a single flickering light bulb. It was unnervingly detailed, with waxy-looking skin, matted synthetic hair, and a slack-jawed expression. It was creepy, but it was just part of the scenery. On my first few nights, I barely even noticed it. I was too busy learning my cues and trying to get my timing right for the scares. But after about a week, you settle into a routine, and you start to notice things. One night, during a quiet spell between groups, I was just sitting in my corner, and I happened to look over at the mannequin, and I felt sure its head was tilted at a slightly different angle than it had been at the start of my shift. It was looking more towards the door now. I figured one of the guys must have adjusted it while I wasn't looking, trying to make it more effective. I didn't think much of it, but then it became a pattern. The next night, I noticed that one of the leather buckles on the straitjacket restraint was undone, just hanging loose. I knew it had been buckled before because part of the pre-opening checklist was to make sure all the props were set correctly. The night after that, its left hand, which had been flat on the gurney, was now sort of curled into a loose fist. They were tiny, insignificant changes, the kind of thing you could easily convince yourself you were imagining. But it was happening every single night. I would start my shift, take a mental picture of the mannequin, and by the end of the night, some little detail would be wrong. I tried to bring it up with my shift manager. I found him near the entrance and told him I thought someone was messing with the prop in my room. He just gave me this tired, annoyed look. He walked back with me, shined his flashlight on the mannequin for about 2 seconds, shrugged, and then pointed me back to my corner, a clear sign to just drop it and get back to work. He didn't care. The other actors were different, though. I noticed none of the veteran employees ever wanted to be assigned to my room. One night I tried to trade rooms with another actor, an older guy who had worked there for years. I told him I wanted a change of scenery. When I mentioned which room was mine, he just shook his head instantly and walked away without a word. It was then that I realized they all knew. They knew something was off about that room, about that prop, and their way of dealing with it was just to avoid it, to leave the new hires like me to deal with it. The whole situation escalated on Halloween itself. The warehouse was packed, and the groups were coming through nonstop. I was exhausted and on edge. Around midnight, during another rare lull, I looked over at the gurney, and my stomach just went cold. The mannequin's head was turned almost 90 degrees, so that its blank, waxy face was staring directly at me in my corner. And both of its arms, which were supposed to be strapped down, were now resting on its chest. I didn't scream. I finished my shift, but I kept my eye on the thing the entire time. The next day, I went straight to the manager and told him the fog fluid they used in the asylum room was irritating my throat and I needed to be moved. It was a total lie, but he bought it. He grumbled but reassigned me to one of the clown rooms near the entrance. As I was leaving the office, one of the guys who'd worked there for years, a guy who ran the lighting, caught my eye. He just gave me this small, knowing nod. He He told me, in a low voice, not to worry about it. He said nobody likes working in the patient room, and that the thing on the gurney was the oldest prop in the whole building. Apparently, it had belonged to the original owner's father, who had collected old medical equipment. He didn't say anything else, but it was enough. They all knew. They just didn't talk about it. About 5 years ago, my wife and I decided to leave the city. We bought a small, very affordable house in a tiny, isolated town a few hours north. It was one of those places that felt like it was stuck in time. The people were quiet but polite, and the town ran on its own set of very old, unspoken rules. We moved in during the late summer, and as autumn rolled in, we were kind of excited for our first Halloween there. We figured a town this old would have some really charming, quaint traditions, and we were right, just not in the way we expected. As October started, we noticed people putting out their Halloween decorations. But something was different. No one had pumpkins. Not a single one. Instead, every single house, from the little cottages to the bigger farmhouses on the edge of town, had a carved turnip sitting on their front porch. And the carvings were all identical. They weren't scary or happy. They just had 2 simple round holes for eyes and a single straight line for a mouth. It was this blank, unsmiling, vaguely human face. They looked less like decorations and more like little sentinels. We thought it was just a cute, historical thing. I knew that the original jack-o'-lanterns in Ireland and Scotland were carved from turnips and potatoes, so I figured it was just the town keeping an old tradition alive. We wanted to fit in, but we also wanted to do our own thing. We drove out to a bigger town about an hour away, went to a supermarket, and bought a big, bright orange pumpkin. I spent that afternoon on our porch carving it. I gave it a big, goofy, smiling face with classic triangle eyes. I was pretty proud of it. When I set it out by our front door, it felt so cheerful and bright compared to the pale, grim-looking turnips on every other porch. That evening, we noticed our neighbors seemed to be looking at our house more than usual. The woman next door, an older lady who we'd only ever exchanged polite nods with, came over while I was getting the mail. She didn't say hello. She just looked at our pumpkin, then back at me, and said that our decoration was very loud. The way she said it didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a warning. That night, I was woken up by a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic noise coming from the front of the house, a sort of thumping and scraping. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy and rough across the wood of our porch. I sat up in bed, listening. It went on for maybe a minute, slow and deliberate, and then it just stopped. The house was completely silent again, but I was too nervous to get up and look out the window. I just laid there for a long time before I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went to get the paper, and my stomach just dropped. Our smiling pumpkin was gone from the porch. I looked out at the street and saw it, smashed to pieces in the road. And sitting right in the center of our doormat, exactly where the pumpkin had been, was a freshly carved turnip. It was crudely cut, but the face was unmistakable. 2 round eyes and a single straight, unsmiling line for a mouth. It looked just like all the others. The message couldn't have been clearer. I didn't know who had done it, or what. But they had taken our pumpkin and replaced it. They had corrected our mistake. I just picked up the turnip, brought it inside, and threw it in the trash. We learned pretty quickly that in that town, you don't try to be different. You just do what everyone else does. We lived here for 5 years now, and every Halloween we carve a turnip, just like everyone else. I used to live in one of those suburban neighborhoods where all the houses are pretty much the same 2 or 3 designs repeated over and over. It was a quiet place, very family-oriented. The guy who lived across the street from me was really, really into Halloween. I mean, he went all out. Starting on October 1st, his front lawn would slowly transform into this elaborate, creepy scene. He'd put up fake tombstones, hang skeletons from the big oak tree, and he had about a dozen of these unsettling, scarecrow-like figures he would arrange in different poses. They were homemade, built on wooden frames with burlap sack heads and old, tattered clothes. They didn't have faces, just blank surfaces, which somehow made them even creepier. Every year it was the same routine. On the morning of November 1st, like clockwork, he would be out there taking it all down. By the time I left for work, his lawn would be completely clear, back to normal for another 11 months. It was just a part of the neighborhood's rhythm, but a few years ago, that changed. On the morning of November 1st, I woke up, looked out my bedroom window like I always do, and saw that the lawn across the street was empty. All the tombstones, the skeletons, all of it was gone, except for one. A single scarecrow was left, and it wasn't in any of its old positions. It had been moved to the dead center of the lawn, standing perfectly upright, and it was turned to face my house, directly at my house, aimed right at my front window. I figured the guy just ran out of time that morning and would get the last one later. It was weird, but explainable. I went to work, but when I came home that evening, it was still there, standing in the middle of the perfectly normal empty lawn, looking at my house as the sun went down. For the next 3 days, it didn't move. It just stood there. It became the first thing I looked for in the morning and the last thing I saw when I got home at night. It was unnerving. The lack of movement was what made it so creepy. Birds wouldn't land on it. The wind would rustle the trees around it, but its tattered clothes never seemed to flutter. It was just this static, silent figure, its blank head aimed right at me. I started to notice other things too. Dog walkers would cross to the other side of the street to avoid walking past that lawn. Kids on their bikes would swerve out into the road to give it a wide berth. Nobody talked about it, but everyone was aware of it. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept getting up and looking out the window, and it was there, a dark shape in the moonlight. I finally fell asleep on the couch around 4 a.m. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to rise. I looked out the window, and the lawn was empty. The last scarecrow was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there, just a small, barely visible patch of disturbed grass in the center of the yard. My neighbor's car was in his driveway, same as always. He never mentioned it, and I was honestly too unnerved to ask him about it. It's been a few years since then, and he still does his big Halloween display every October. But I've noticed that he only ever puts out 11 scarecrows now, never a dozen.